My name is Dana Russell. I'm 32 years old, and last Christmas my father made it very clear what I was worth to him. He was sitting at the head of the table, carving the ham like it was any other year, talking about football and work and how kids these days don't understand sacrifice. My plate was untouched. My hands were shaking under the table, resting on a secret I'd been carrying for 3 months. When everyone finally went quiet, I cleared my throat. "I'm pregnant," I said. For a second you could have heard a pin drop. My mother's fork froze halfway to her mouth. My little sister stared at me like I'd spoken another language. The man I love squeezed my knee under the table. My father didn't smile. He didn't say congratulations. He pushed back his chair, stood up, and looked at me like I'd just ruined his life. "I don't want you or that baby in this family," he said. "You're done here. You're out of my will. As far as I'm concerned, you're already gone." Nobody said a word. Nobody defended me. I felt the same cold I'd felt a few months earlier when he'd yelled, "All you do is take. You've never given this family anything." So I stood up, walked around the table, and set a small wrapped box right in front of his plate. If that's how you feel," I told him, "you should open this now." Then I picked up my coat and walked out of the house I had spent years secretly helping him keep. Because when he opened that box, he didn't just lose his favorite illusion about me. He started losing everything he thought he controlled. If you've ever been called selfish for finally saying no to your own family, stick around. Like, subscribe, and let me tell you how this Christmas disaster turned into my escape plan. There's a part of every story that remains hidden until someone finally reaches the point where silence feels heavier than truth. For me, that part stretches back years before anything ever collapsed, woven into the background of my life in the outskirts of Dallas. People like to say childhood shapes you, but mine shaped me in ways I didn't recognize until much later. It wasn't dramatic or tragic. It was subtle, persistent, and quiet enough to pass as normal. Being the middle child came with an unspoken script. My brother carried the expectations of success, and my sister carried the fragile sweetness my parents instinctively protected. Somewhere between them, I learned the art of being unnoticed. No one assigned me that position. Life simply arranged itself that way, and I adapted before I understood what adapting even meant. I became the steady one, the dependable one, the child who didn't cause trouble and didn't need attention. While other kids pushed boundaries, I monitored mine carefully. If something around the house needed handling, I handled it. If someone misplaced something important, I always seemed to know where it was. When chores piled up, I took them as a sign that I should do more, not less. It felt natural then, almost comforting, like earning my place through quiet competence. I didn't realize I was training myself to accept responsibility without questioning whether it belonged to me. School didn't offer much of an escape, but it offered structure. Numbers, deadlines, and rules made sense in ways emotions didn't. When I learned I had a talent for organization and problem solving, I leaned into it. Scholarships came from effort, not favoritism. Jobs came from qualification, not charm. And every victory felt clean, earned, and separate from the unpredictable dynamics at home. Those early habits formed the backbone of who I became: self-reliant, steady, and practical. But self-reliance comes with a catch. Once people see you can carry weight, they rarely think to ask how much it costs you. When I earned my degree and started working full-time, the shift happened slowly, almost invisibly. It wasn't a request for help. It was the suggestion that I was now in a position to contribute. The phrasing was always soft, thoughtful, wrapped in comments about how adulthood works and how families pull together. My father mentioned rising mortgage pressures during dinner one night. My mother brought up the strain of unexpected medical bills from a routine appointment. My brother vented about delays in his business plans and how a small boost would fix everything. My sister confessed her credit card balance had spiraled out of control. None of them looked at me directly when they spoke. They didn't need to. The implication floated easily in the air, landing on my shoulders as naturally as breathing. At first, I didn't mind. Helping felt like an extension of the role I'd always played. I stepped in automatically, telling myself that stability was something I could provide, and that providing it made me useful, even valued. A few payments toward the mortgage seemed harmless. Covering a portion of overdue bills felt reasonable. Supporting my brother's latest plan seemed like optimism rather than obligation. Paying down my sister's card balance felt like a kindness, but kindness loses its meaning when it becomes routine. Over time, gratitude shifted into expectation. My father began treating my contributions as proof of responsibility rather than generosity. My mother sighed with a particular tone whenever I hesitated. My brother framed his setbacks as shared burdens. My sister assumed her mistakes would be softened before consequences reached her. I had slipped into a role none of us ever defined, yet all of us silently relied on. Looking back, I can see how each act of help placed another invisible stone on a structure that was never meant to be mine alone. No one pushed me into it, but no one pulled me out either. I assumed being dependable would earn understanding, boundaries, maybe even respect. Instead, it built a version of me that everyone accepted as limitless. For years, I kept moving forward without noticing how far I'd drifted from my own path. While my friends planned for their futures, I planned around other people's emergencies. While they saved for things they wanted, I saved for things someone else might suddenly need. I didn't call it sacrifice at the time. I called it being part of a family. Only later did I realize the truth. What I called loyalty, everyone else treated as inevitability. And inevitability, once accepted, becomes almost impossible to break. Until the moment something forces you to see it clearly for the first time. There comes a point in every imbalance where the weight finally becomes measurable. For me, that moment arrived most clearly during the months when my career began to settle into a rhythm I had worked years to build. I had become the operations manager at a mid-sized logistics company, and for the first time, my income felt predictable rather than fragile. I thought that stability would give me room to breathe. Instead, it quietly widened the gap between what I carried and what everyone else expected from me. My father was the first to treat my progress as a resource rather than a milestone. His tone never shifted dramatically, but his assumptions did. If his truck needed servicing, I was the one best equipped to handle it. If unexpected costs appeared around the house, he mentioned them in a way that nudged responsibility toward me. He never said the words outright. The implication was enough. My mother followed the same pattern with a softer voice, framing her needs as burdens she hated to bring up, yet somehow always bringing them up when my week was already stretched thin. What unsettled me most was how natural my compliance felt. Every time I stepped in, part of me believed I was simply doing what anyone in my position would do. It didn't occur to me that my position existed only because I had forced myself into it over years of habit. I told myself I was being supportive, reliable, grounded, qualities I had spent my entire life perfecting. What I didn't see was how those same qualities masked the boundaries I'd never learned to establish. As the requests grew more frequent, I noticed a shift in how I viewed myself. Each demand carved away a small piece of my autonomy, and I surrendered those pieces as if losing them was expected. I ignored my own plans, redirecting money I intended to save into issues that were never mine. I canceled trips I had been excited about, convinced that my presence was required at home for reasons no one fully explained. My family didn't need to justify anything. I was the justification. That unspoken obligation shaped the way I navigated relationships too. When I met Ethan, a quiet, thoughtful man who worked in emergency management, I hesitated more than I admitted. I wasn't used to someone asking how my day had been with genuine interest. I wasn't used to someone insisting I didn't have to handle everything alone. His patience unsettled me because it highlighted how much of my life revolved around managing other people's crises. Even when he encouraged me to set limits, I struggled to articulate where those limits should be. There were nights when I sat in my apartment, staring at my bank statements, trying to track where my earnings had gone. Rent, groceries, savings, those were easy to understand. The rest of the expenses blurred into endless transfers labeled as support, assistance, or family obligations. I knew the amounts were substantial, but what weighed more heavily was the realization that no one ever asked if I could sustain that level of giving. They assumed I could. Therefore, I should. Despite everything, I still rationalized their reliance. Families go through tough periods, I told myself. Shared responsibility is part of being connected. Yet the connection felt increasingly one-sided, pulling rather than supporting. I began noticing the emotional distance between what I hoped for and what existed. When friends spoke about calling their parents for comfort or advice, I found myself unable to relate. Conversations with my own family revolved around logistics and solutions, rarely affection or curiosity. The strain deepened as I became more aware of what I had sacrificed. The savings I hoped to build for a home of my own remained stagnant. The time I wanted to invest in my relationship with Ethan was interrupted by constant emergencies elsewhere. Even my sense of self-confidence wavered, eroded by years of being valued primarily for what I could provide rather than who I was. I tried setting small boundaries, but each attempt met resistance. Disappointment from my mother, irritation from my father, passive frustration from my siblings. Through it all, I kept waiting for someone to acknowledge how much I carried. I didn't expect gratitude, just recognition, something that signaled they understood the weight I balanced. But the acknowledgement never came. Instead, the reliance grew heavier, normalized by repetition and silence. I reached a point where the imbalance settled into my bones, shaping my days with a pressure I could feel but never quite measure. By then, the pattern was firmly in place. I had become the anchor for a ship no one else seemed willing to steer. I convinced myself that endurance was the same as loyalty, that dedication excused exhaustion, and that giving more would eventually lead to fairness. What I didn't realize then was that the greatest deception wasn't what my family believed. It was what I had convinced myself to accept. Progress in life has a way of exposing the fault lines we trained ourselves to ignore. When I look back at that stage of my life, I can see how clearly the strain accumulated in the spaces I had tried to fill without question. It became most apparent during the period when Ethan and I began talking about moving in together. What should have been an exciting transition instead revealed how tightly my family's needs were wound around my decisions. The idea of sharing a home with someone who treated me as an equal brought both anticipation and unease. I had never lived with a partner before, and I wasn't used to imagining a future that centered my wants. The possibility felt fragile, as though acknowledging my own desires might provoke a reaction from the people who had long benefited from my silence. My instinct was to hide the news, not because I doubted Ethan, but because I feared how the shift in my priorities would be interpreted at home. As the weeks went on, the changes in my life seemed to unsettle my father more than I expected. He had always been particular about control, order, structure, hierarchy. Any decision I made that operated outside his influence carried an invisible weight. I felt it each time he asked about my plans, his questions framed as casual, but laced with a discomfort he never acknowledged outright. The more my independence grew, the more he appeared to tighten his grip through small, pointed reminders of obligations I hadn't fulfilled or responsibilities I had supposedly neglected. My mother reacted differently. She oscillated between warm curiosity and subtle guilt-tripping, as though my happiness was something to support only as long as it didn't interfere with the family's routines. She didn't say the words, but her expressions conveyed enough. The delicate mixture of pride and disappointment that left me guessing which one she felt more strongly. I tried to interpret her hints generously, but the tension lingered beneath every conversation. My siblings added their own complications. My brother Patrick treated my new chapter as inconvenient timing, particularly when he needed help refinancing a project he had mismanaged. He made remarks that suggested my life was becoming too busy now that I was playing house, as if my progress came at his expense. My sister Lena approached the situation with passive resignation, assuming I would still rescue her from whatever crisis emerged next. She spoke about her issues with the certainty of someone accustomed to a safety net she never built herself. Amid all the shifting dynamics, the most jarring realization was how deeply I measured my choices through the lens of expected sacrifice. Each time Ethan and I discussed our shared future, routines, finances, even weekend plans, I felt an undercurrent of hesitation. Not because I feared commitment, but because I was unaccustomed to imagining a life where my obligations didn't automatically expand to accommodate everyone else's needs. I had spent so long living reactively that planning anything independent felt like rebellion. The balancing act grew heavier as the move-in date approached. When Ethan asked if I was stressed, I found myself unable to respond honestly. I didn't know how to explain that my anxiety wasn't about us, but about the unspoken backlash I anticipated from my family. He saw the fatigue in my posture, the way I overthought small decisions, the hesitation in my voice. His patience never wavered, but patience only works when the person receiving it believes they deserve it. I wasn't there yet. Despite my internal struggle, I continued moving forward with the logistical parts of the transition: packing, sorting, planning. Each step forced me to confront how intertwined my finances had become with my family's habits. There were payments I had nearly forgotten about, commitments I had absorbed without noticing, transfers that blended into the rhythm of my months. Seeing them all laid out in front of me felt like examining a blueprint of obligations I had built without understanding their long-term impact. The more I prepared for my new life, the more the imbalance revealed itself in sharp, undeniable ways. My father's tone grew clipped whenever I mentioned focusing on myself. My mother's sighs lingered in the air like subtle reprimands. Patrick became increasingly frustrated when I didn't respond quickly to his requests. Lena reacted with confusion when I didn't immediately offer a solution to her latest problem. Every interaction made it clearer that my role in the family was defined by what I could provide, not who I was becoming. It was during one of those final weeks of preparation that a quiet shift occurred within me. I started recognizing the difference between love and dependency, between support and exploitation. I realized that the discomfort surrounding my independence wasn't a reflection of my choices, but a reflection of how much my family relied on the version of me that never said no. The more I stepped toward the life I wanted, the more their expectations resisted the change. What I didn't know then was that this tension, subtle yet persistent, was building toward a breaking point I couldn't have predicted. And when it finally arrived, it would unravel years of unspoken agreements in a way none of us were prepared for. There are moments in life when pressure stops being subtle and becomes unmistakable, settling into the air like a storm you can sense before it breaks open. That shift arrived for me during the weeks when my pregnancy was still a secret, a delicate truth I carried quietly while the rest of my life continued moving with its familiar weight. I hadn't planned the timing, yet the news brought a kind of clarity that made everything around me feel sharper, more revealing, as if the smallest interaction showed truths I had tried for years not to see. The first sign of change came through my own body. Exhaustion hit me in waves I couldn't ignore, forcing me to slow down in ways I wasn't accustomed to. For the first time, I couldn't simply push through responsibility. My energy dictated my limits. That vulnerability felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, because I had always built my routines around endurance. Now my body demanded gentleness, and responding to that demand felt like learning an entirely new language. I found myself reevaluating everything, including the habits I had taken for granted. My evenings became quieter, my priorities more focused. I stopped automatically answering every call, stopped rearranging my schedule to accommodate last-minute interruptions, stopped pretending I could stretch myself without consequence. The more I listened inward, the more I recognized how much I had neglected myself in the name of duty. Despite the internal clarity, the external world didn't slow down to match it. My family grew increasingly restless in ways that made the shift inside me even more visible. My father's expectations thickened with an edge I couldn't quite ignore, especially when he questioned why I had become less available lately. His remarks weren't angry yet, but they carried an undercurrent of disapproval, as if my independence threatened an unspoken system he needed to preserve. My mother sensed something different in me as well, though she interpreted it through her own lens. She watched me with a softness tinged by suspicion, noticing the changes in my habits, the careful way I moved, the distance in my replies when she hinted at tasks she thought I should take on. Her concern came wrapped in subtle guilt, a quiet reminder that stepping away from obligation made her uneasy. Patrick added to the tension with a kind of impatience that bordered on entitlement. Every problem he brought me felt more urgent, more dramatic, more overshadowing of anything I might be dealing with myself. He had grown accustomed to being prioritized, and even the slightest delay in my responses seemed to unsettle him. Lena, on the other hand, drifted in and out of my days with her usual quiet dependence, assuming I would absorb her worries the moment she shared them. Amid all the noise, the life growing inside me became an anchor. I wasn't sure when it happened, but I began thinking differently. Less about managing crises, and more about protecting the space I would soon need. I imagined the kind of environment I wanted to raise a child in, and that thought alone made the expectations around me feel heavier than ever. I knew I could no longer stretch myself thin without consequence, and for the first time, the thought of saying no didn't feel selfish, it felt necessary. Ethan's presence grounded me. Even without knowing the full truth yet, he sensed the shift. His steadiness made room for emotions I didn't know how to express. When he asked how I was doing, the question felt genuine, not a prelude to a request. But understanding that kind of care required a vulnerability I wasn't used to. I had spent so long carrying everything alone that leaning into someone else's support felt foreign, almost dangerous, as if accepting help meant unlearning a lifetime of survival. The tension built slowly, tightening around the routines I had once moved through easily. Each interaction with my family made the divide clearer, the life I was stepping into, and the life they still expected from me, no longer overlapped. Their needs didn't pause simply because my reality had changed. If anything, their demands became louder, pushing against the space I was trying to create. It was during those tightening weeks that I sensed a collision coming, a moment where my private truth and their expectations would inevitably intersect. I couldn't hide forever. The news would demand to be spoken aloud. Part of me feared that moment, but another part welcomed it, knowing that I could no longer live in the widening gap between who they wanted me to be and who I was becoming. What I didn't realize was how quickly that collision would arrive, or how profoundly it would unravel the fragile balance I had held together for so long. There comes a time when pressure stops whispering and starts pressing directly against your ribs, making you aware of every breath you take. That shift settled over me during the days when my pregnancy was no longer just a private secret. It had become a quiet truth shaping every decision I made. I hadn't told anyone yet, but the knowledge lived in the background of my choices, urging me to reevaluate what I had once accepted without question. The first sign that something was changing came through the way I reacted to responsibility. Tasks that once felt routine became heavier, not because they had grown in difficulty, but because I finally recognized how much energy I had been expending without pause. I moved through my days with a heightened awareness, noticing the moments when my body asked for rest, the hours when I could no longer push myself past exhaustion, the small waves of protectiveness I felt toward a future I had only just begun to imagine. As my awareness deepened, the imbalance around me became harder to ignore. My father's expectations pressed more firmly, as if my shifting priorities threatened an invisible order he believed he was entitled to maintain. He questioned my choices with a sharpness that revealed more than frustration. It showed fear. Fear that I might pull away. Fear that I might no longer serve the role he had silently assigned me. Fear that independence meant disobedience. My mother responded with a gentler kind of unease, one that manifested in lingering glances and hesitations in her voice. She sensed something different in my behavior but interpreted it through worry rather than intuition. Her concern wasn't malicious, yet it carried a weight of its own, an emotional reminder that my family had grown accustomed to a version of me that never wavered, never prioritized myself, never created distance. The tension reached a breaking point on a day that should have passed without incident. It began with a request, one more demand layered onto a stack that had been accumulating for years. Patrick needed assistance again, this time with an expense he had allowed to grow unchecked. He mentioned it casually, as though the timing of my life had no bearing on his expectations. There was no urgency in his voice, only confidence that I would manage it. He had built an entire routine around my reliability, and in his mind, deviation from that routine bordered on betrayal. For the first time, I hesitated. The pause was small, hardly noticeable, but inside me, it felt seismic. That hesitation created a crack in the pattern I had followed for so long. And through that crack, years of exhaustion poured into view. I realized how thoroughly I had conditioned myself to respond automatically, without considering the cost. I realized how little space I had left for my own needs. And for the first time, I realized how deeply unfair it was that my growing child existed in the shadow of obligations that had nothing to do with the life I wanted to build. That awareness settled heavily over my thoughts throughout the day. I found myself walking more slowly, noticing the way my heart reacted to stress, feeling a protective instinct sharpen inside me. Every decision I had made up until that point had revolved around accommodation, making space for everyone else, even when it meant shrinking my own world. But pregnancy refused to let me shrink anymore. It demanded expansion, clarity, and boundaries I had never set. Ethan remained unaware of the full reason behind my exhaustion, yet he sensed something deeper than fatigue. He watched me carefully, giving me room without asking for explanations I wasn't ready to share. His steadiness comforted me, but it also highlighted a truth I had tried not to confront. The people who claimed to love me the most expected the most from me, while the person who asked for nothing offered the most support. The contrast unsettled me in ways I couldn't express. I had spent so long believing that loyalty meant endurance, that sacrifice equaled love, that compliance created harmony. But harmony built on silence is nothing more than a performance, and I was no longer willing to perform. As the day faded, I felt something inside me harden, not into anger, but into certainty. Certainty that the path ahead would demand more of me than I had ever allowed myself to give to my own well-being. Certainty that protecting my future would require challenging the past. Certainty that the people who relied on my compliance would not let go of their expectations without resistance. What I didn't yet know was how swiftly that resistance would rise, or how devastating the consequences would be when the truth I had been carrying finally collided with the family who believed they were entitled to every part of me. There is a silence that forms right before a life splits in two, before the version you once lived gives way to the version you can no longer avoid. That silence followed me into the evening of Christmas, long after I left my father's table and stepped into the cold air outside. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I simply felt a steadiness rise within me, the kind that comes when the truth finally stops being afraid of itself. I drove home with a clarity I hadn't expected. The road felt strangely familiar, as though I had traveled it 100 times without ever really noticing the turns. My hands stayed firm on the wheel, and with each mile the weight of years began loosening its hold on me. I kept thinking about the small gift box I had left in front of my father, the one I had chosen carefully, the one he didn't deserve to open, but needed to. Inside it was nothing dramatic, nothing cruel, just receipts. Plain evidence of a lifetime of support he had rewritten as selfishness. I didn't return to hear his reaction. I didn't need to. The days that followed unfolded with a strange calm. Where guilt once would have pulled me back into old routines, I felt only a quiet certainty that distance was my only protection. Messages from my family came quickly at first, sharp, then panicked, then guilt-ridden, but I didn't respond. I watched each notification appear like echoes of a system collapsing under the weight of its own assumptions. They weren't contacting me because they missed me. They were contacting me because the structure they relied on had started to crack. Ethan stayed close, though I hadn't yet told him the truth about the pregnancy. He sensed the shift. He sensed the exhaustion behind my calm. He didn't push, didn't pressure, didn't demand. His presence felt like steady ground, the kind I wasn't used to trusting. And yet, each hour I spent away from the noise of my family made space for something else to expand. Self-respect, perhaps. Or simply the relief of not carrying everyone else's chaos. As the week settled, more consequences surfaced. My father's frustration turned into anger when he realized his finances no longer balanced without the quiet contributions I had made for years. My mother left long, rambling messages laced with confusion and fear, as though she couldn't understand how someone like me, someone who always surrendered, could choose to walk away. Patrick grew irritated, then desperate, when his unresolved expenses caught up to him. Lena's messages were the softest, full of confusion rather than blame, but even hers carried expectation beneath the surface. Their unraveling did not bring me joy. It brought clarity. For the first time, I saw the truth without the filter of obligation. They were not collapsing because I had betrayed them. They were collapsing because they had never learned how to stand without me. The day I finally told Ethan about the pregnancy, his reaction surprised me in a way that made my throat tighten. There was no shock, no panic, just a quiet acceptance, followed by a warmth that made something inside me loosen. For years, I had believed that support required sacrifice, that love meant becoming smaller so others could lean harder. But he gave without taking. He listened without demanding. He stood beside me without trying to claim ownership of my decisions. It showed me something I had never been allowed to see. Not all families drain you. Some people simply care. As the final days of the year approached, I made a decision that once would have terrified me. I blocked every number connected to my family, not out of anger, but out of necessity. My life had grown larger than their expectations, and the child I carried deserved a version of me that wasn't shaped by fear or exhaustion. I couldn't change the past, and I couldn't force them to recognize the truth. But I could choose what future I stepped into, and I chose freedom. In the quiet afterward, as I sat near the window of my apartment and watched the soft glow of winter lights across the city, I understood something I wish I had learned earlier. Love is not proven by how much you endure. Love is measured by presence, respect, and reciprocity, things my family had never learned to offer. Walking away didn't destroy me, it rebuilt me. If my story holds any meaning, it is this. You do not owe loyalty to the people who thrive on your silence. You owe honesty to yourself and protection to the life you are building. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to shrink any further. And sometimes the greatest gift you can leave on the table is the truth.